The federal agent looked me straight in the eye and said the words I had been waiting to hear for 3 hours. "Ma'am, what Sheriff Karen did here today constitutes a federal crime." I watched through my cabin window as Karen's face went pale, her badge suddenly feeling heavy on her chest. The same badge she had waved around like a weapon just hours earlier, threatening to arrest me on my own property. The wildlife sanctuary I had spent years building was finally safe, but Karen's nightmare was just beginning. My alarm went off at 5:30 every morning, just like it had for the past 4 years. I rolled out of bed and pulled on my work boots, the familiar routine bringing me comfort in the mountain silence. Outside my cabin window, the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the towering pines, casting golden streaks across the animal enclosures that surrounded my home. This was not just a cabin. This was a federally licensed wildlife rescue and rehabilitation center, and every morning brought new responsibilities. I walked the gravel path between the specialized habitats I had built with my own hands, checking on each of my patients with the care of a mother watching over her children. In the flight cage, a red-tailed hawk named Ranger was recovering from a wing fracture. He had been hit by a car 3 weeks ago, and his wing was finally strong enough to support short flights. I watched him stretch his magnificent wings, knowing that in another week, he would be ready to return to the wild where he belonged. The deer enclosure held 2 orphaned fawns whose mother had been killed by poachers. They were old enough now to forage on their own, but still too young to survive the harsh mountain winters. I scattered their morning feed and watched them bound across the grass, their spotted coats gleaming in the morning light. Each animal here had a story. Each one had been brought to me by forest rangers, wildlife officers, or concerned citizens who knew that my facility was their best chance for survival. The federal permits hanging in my office were not just pieces of paper. They represented years of training, inspections, and dedication to a cause that consumed my entire life. The isolation of my mountain property was not accidental. Wildlife rehabilitation required peace and quiet, away from the stress of human activity. The animals needed to maintain their wild instincts, not become dependent on human contact. That was why the access road to my cabin was marked with federal restriction signs, warning unauthorized visitors to stay away. I checked the medical supplies in my treatment room, the same room where I had performed surgery on countless injured creatures. The shelves were stocked with antibiotics, bandages, and specialized equipment that most veterinary clinics could not afford. Every piece of equipment had been purchased with my own money or through grants from conservation organizations. This sanctuary was my life's work. It was legal, licensed, and protected by federal law. The paperwork in my filing cabinet could prove every claim I made about the facility's legitimacy. I had built something pure and meaningful in these mountains, a place where nature could heal away from the chaos of the outside world. But that morning, as I finished my rounds and headed back to the cabin for breakfast, I had no idea that chaos was about to find me. I had no idea that a corrupt sheriff with an entitled attitude was about to discover what happens when local authority clashes with federal law. The mountains were about to teach Sheriff Karen a lesson she would never forget. The sound of multiple vehicles grinding up my access road shattered the morning peace like a gunshot through glass. I looked up from feeding the rabbits, my heart immediately racing. Unauthorized vehicles on my property always meant trouble, but the aggressive rumble of these engines suggested something worse than lost tourists. 3 SUVs emerged from the tree line, their engines revving unnecessarily loud as they approached my cabin. The lead vehicle was a police cruiser, its light bar gleaming in the morning sun like a crown of authority. Behind it followed two civilian vehicles packed with people carrying overnight bags and coolers. The cruiser door slammed shut with deliberate force, and out stepped a woman I would never forget. Sheriff Karen Martinez stood nearly 6 feet tall, her uniform pressed to perfection, and her badge polished to a mirror shine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched the stern expression on her face as she surveyed my property like she owned it. "You there," she called out, her voice cutting through the mountain air with practiced authority. "We are here for our cabin rental reservation." I set down the rabbit feed and walked toward the vehicles, my mind racing to understand what was happening. The people climbing out of the other SUVs looked like they were ready for a weekend getaway, complete with hiking boots and expensive outdoor gear. They were looking around my property with the excited expressions of tourists who had paid good money for a mountain experience. "I am sorry, but there has been some mistake," I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful. "This is not a rental property. This is a licensed wildlife rescue facility." Karen's expression shifted from authoritative to annoyed in the span of a heartbeat. She adjusted her gun belt and took several steps closer to me, clearly intending to use her physical presence as intimidation. "Listen here," she said, her voice dropping to the tone police officers use when they want civilians to understand who is in charge. "I do not care what kind of little animal hobby you have going on here. We have a reservation. We drove 3 hours to get here, and we are not leaving empty-handed." I could see her guests exchanging uncomfortable glances behind her. They had obviously not signed up for a confrontation, but Karen seemed oblivious to their growing discomfort. Her focus was entirely on me, and I could see the calculation in her eyes as she decided how much authority she would need to use to get her way. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration," I replied, pulling out my phone to show her the federal permits that proved my facility's legitimacy. "But this property is protected under federal wildlife conservation laws. It is not available for public access." Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. She waved her hand at my phone like she was swatting away a fly. "Federal laws," she repeated with mock seriousness. "You know what trumps your federal laws? This badge right here." She tapped the silver star on her chest with her index finger. "Local Law Enforcement Authority, and I am telling you that we are staying in this cabin tonight." The threat in her voice was unmistakable. This was not a request or even a demand. This was a corrupt police officer telling a law-abiding citizen that legal protections meant nothing when they inconvenienced her personal plans. Behind her, one of her guests cleared his throat nervously. "Karen, maybe we should just find a hotel in town." "Absolutely not," Karen snapped without turning around. "I promised you people a mountain cabin experience, and that is exactly what you are going to get." I realized in that moment that Sheriff Karen had no intention of listening to reason, respecting federal law, or acknowledging that she might be wrong. She had brought paying guests to my property under false pretenses, and now her pride was more important to her than the law she had sworn to uphold. The peaceful sanctuary I had built was about to become a battleground. Karen's frustration transformed into something far more dangerous as I continued to deny her access to my cabin. Her hand moved instinctively to her utility belt, where an array of police equipment hung like tools of intimidation. The morning sun glinted off her handcuffs, taser, and pepper spray as she shifted her weight into an aggressive stance. "You know what I think," she said, her voice taking on the calculated tone of someone who had used their authority to bully civilians many times before. "I think you are running some kind of illegal operation up here. All these cages and restricted signs. That sounds like probable cause to me." My heart began pounding as I realized what she was threatening. Karen was preparing to fabricate evidence of criminal activity to justify forcing her way onto my property. I had heard stories of corrupt police officers planting evidence or manufacturing probable cause, but I had never imagined it happening to me. I pulled out my phone and began recording, making sure Karen could see exactly what I was doing. "Ma'am, I am documenting this interaction for my own protection. This property is a federally licensed wildlife rehabilitation facility, and you do not have legal authority to enter without proper warrants or federal oversight." Karen's eyes narrowed as she noticed the camera. Instead of backing down, her aggression escalated to a level that shocked even her own guests. "Are you recording me?" she demanded. "That is obstruction of justice. I could arrest you right now for interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "You came here demanding access to a cabin rental that does not exist. There was no investigation until you decided to create one." The logic of my statement seemed to infuriate Karen even more. She unclipped her radio and spoke into it with exaggerated authority. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Martinez. I need backup at the Mountain Wildlife Facility. I have a potentially hostile subject refusing to cooperate with law enforcement." I watched in amazement as Karen twisted the situation completely around in her radio call. According to her version of events, I was the problem. I was the criminal. She was just a dedicated police officer trying to do her job against an uncooperative suspect. Karen's guests were backing away toward their vehicles, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly the situation had escalated. The weekend getaway they had paid for was turning into a front-row seat to police corruption in action. "Karen," one of them called out, "maybe we should just go back to town and figure this out later." "Nobody is going anywhere," Karen snapped, her authority complex now fully engaged. "This person is trying to hide something, and I am going to find out what it is." She approached my cabin door and tested the handle, finding it locked. Rather than accepting that as the end of the matter, she began examining the windows and looking for other potential entry points. Her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as her plan to intimidate me into compliance failed. "Ma'am," I said firmly, "if you enter my property without proper authority, you will be committing a federal crime. This facility is protected under the Wildlife Conservation Act, and unauthorized entry carries serious penalties." Karen turned back to me with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "You know what I hear when you talk about federal laws? I hear someone who thinks they are above local authority. Well, let me tell you something about federal laws in my county. They only matter if someone is around to enforce them." She began tampering with my security cameras, attempting to disable the recording equipment that documented all activity around the animal enclosures. Each camera was positioned to protect the wildlife from unauthorized human contact, but now they were serving a different purpose entirely. "You are destroying federal property," I warned her, continuing to document everything with my phone. "Each of those cameras is part of a federally mandated security system." Karen's response was to attempt to grab my phone away from me. In that moment, as she reached for my device with clear intent to destroy evidence of her misconduct, I realized that Sheriff Karen was not just corrupt. She was dangerous. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance told me that backup was coming. But whose side would they be on? The approaching sirens grew louder as Karen continued her attempts to intimidate me into surrendering my property. I realized that this confrontation was about to become much larger, and I needed to establish the legal foundation of my position before more officers arrived who might be inclined to support their sheriff regardless of the law. "Sheriff Martinez," I said, maintaining the formal tone that would serve me well if this incident ended up in court, "I need you to understand the legal situation you are creating here." I walked to my cabin door and retrieved a thick folder from just inside the entrance. The folder contained copies of every federal permit, license, and certification that authorized my wildlife rehabilitation facility. Years of paperwork, inspections, and legal compliance were documented in those pages. This facility operates under a federal wildlife rehabilitation permit issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I explained, holding up the official documents. It is also protected under the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Wildlife Conservation Act. Local law enforcement cannot override federal wildlife protection statutes. Karen barely glanced at the paperwork before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "I do not care about your federal permits," she said with breathtaking arrogance. "This is my county, and in my county, local police authority supersedes everything, including your precious federal laws." The sheer audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. Karen was openly declaring that she considered herself above federal law. She was not just corrupt, she was delusional about the scope of her authority. The radio chatter from her approaching backup filled the morning air with official-sounding codes and communications. Karen's confidence grew with each transmission, clearly believing that overwhelming force would resolve the situation in her favor. "You hear that?" she asked with satisfaction. "That is 3 more units responding to assist with this situation. When they get here, we are going to search every inch of this property until we find whatever illegal operation you are hiding." I pulled out my own phone and dialed a number I had hoped never to use. The Federal Wildlife Enforcement hotline connected me directly to agents who specialized in protecting facilities like mine from exactly this kind of harassment. "This is Sarah Mitchell at Mountain Vista Wildlife Rehabilitation Center," I said into the phone, making sure Karen could hear every word. "I have a local sheriff attempting to illegally enter a federally protected wildlife facility. She is threatening to search the property without federal authority or proper warrants." The agent on the other end of the call took down my facility number and immediately began cross-referencing my permits in their database. Within minutes, they confirmed that my facility was in full compliance with all federal regulations and that any interference with its operation would constitute a serious federal offense. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "we are dispatching agents to your location immediately. Do not allow anyone to enter the facility or disturb the wildlife without proper federal oversight." Karen's expression changed as she overheard the federal agent's instructions. For the first time since her arrival, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. The reality of federal involvement was beginning to penetrate her bubble of local authority. "That phone call means nothing," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Federal agents are hours away. My backup will be here in 5 minutes." As if summoned by her words, 3 police cruisers emerged from the tree line and pulled up beside Karen's vehicle. 6 uniformed deputies climbed out, clearly expecting to handle a routine assistance call for their sheriff. But as they approached and began to assess the situation, I could see confusion replacing confidence in their expressions. This was not the simple trespassing call they had been expecting. Federal permits, wildlife enclosures, and legal complexities were not what they had signed up for when they responded to Corinne's backup request. Corinne's own officers were about to discover what I already knew. Their sheriff had led them into a federal jurisdiction issue that was far beyond the scope of local police authority. The sound of helicopters in the distance suggested that federal agents were indeed on their way, and they were not taking any chances with a reported threat to a protected wildlife facility. Corinne's moment of triumph was about to become her worst nightmare. The cavalry that Corinne had summoned to intimidate me into submission arrived in a convoy of flashing lights and official authority. 3 patrol cars disgorged 6 deputies who approached the scene with the confident stride of officers responding to support their sheriff. But as they took in the sight of wildlife enclosures, federal permit signs, and my stack of official documentation, their expressions began to shift from confidence to confusion. Deputy Rodriguez, apparently the senior officer among the backup, approached Corinne with the deference that small-town police hierarchies demanded. "Sheriff, what do we have here?" Corinne's response was immediate and filled with the righteous indignation of someone who believed her own version of events. "This individual is refusing to allow law enforcement access to her property. She claims to have federal permits, but I suspect she is running some kind of illegal wildlife trafficking operation." I watched the deputies exchange glances as they processed Corinne's explanation. These were not corrupt officers looking to support illegal activity. These were professional law enforcement personnel who had expected to assist with a legitimate police matter, not participate in their sheriff's personal vendetta. "Ma'am," Deputy Rodriguez said to me with professional courtesy, "may I see your documentation?" I handed him the complete folder of federal permits, licenses, and inspection reports. Rodriguez reviewed the paperwork with the careful attention of someone who understood the legal implications of what he was reading. His partner, Deputy Chen, walked the perimeter of the animal enclosures, clearly recognizing professional wildlife rehabilitation equipment when she saw it. "Sheriff," Rodriguez said carefully, "these appear to be legitimate federal wildlife rehabilitation permits. This facility is operating under U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Authority." Corinne's response revealed the depth of her commitment to her flawed position. "I do not care what those papers say," she snapped. "We have probable cause to search this property, and that is exactly what we are going to do." The radio on Rodriguez's belt crackled to life with a transmission that changed everything. "All units responding to Mountain Vista Wildlife Center, be advised that federal wildlife enforcement agents are en route to your location. Do not take any enforcement action without federal oversight." The dispatch message hung in the mountain air like a verdict. Corinne's own department was being instructed by higher authorities to stand down and wait for federal agents to handle the situation. Her local authority had just been superseded by the very federal laws she had dismissed. Deputy Chen approached the group with obvious concern on her face. "Sheriff, I think we need to reassess this situation. The facility appears to be completely legitimate, and federal involvement complicates our jurisdiction significantly." I could see Corinne's facade beginning to crumble as her own officers questioned her judgment. The unquestioning support she had expected from her deputies was evaporating as they recognized the legal complexity of the situation she had created. My phone rang with a call from the Federal Wildlife Enforcement Office. I answered on speaker so everyone present could hear the official federal position on Corinne's actions. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Agent Thompson with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Law Enforcement. We have reviewed your facility records, and confirmed that you are in full compliance with all federal regulations. Any attempt to interfere with your operation without proper federal authority constitutes a serious federal offense. The federal agent's words carried a weight that Karen's local authority could not match. We have agents en route to your location with full authority to investigate any interference with your federally protected facility. Please document any attempts at unauthorized entry or intimidation. Karen's guests, who had been watching this drama unfold from beside their vehicles, finally reached their breaking point. "Karen, we are leaving," one of them announced. "This is not what we paid for, and we want no part of whatever legal trouble you are creating." As her paying customers abandoned her, Karen faced the reality that her abuse of authority had created a federal case against her. The same badge she had waved around as a weapon was now a liability that had attracted the attention of federal law enforcement. The approaching sound of helicopters confirmed that federal agents were indeed responding with the seriousness that threats to protected wildlife facilities warranted. Karen's local corruption was about to meet federal justice, and the outcome was not going to favor the sheriff who thought herself above the law. The distant thrum of helicopter rotors grew steadily louder until the sound dominated the mountain valley. Two black helicopters appeared over the tree line, their official markings clearly identifying them as federal law enforcement aircraft. As they circled my property before landing in the clearing adjacent to my cabin, the atmosphere on the ground shifted dramatically. Karen's confident demeanor evaporated completely as the helicopters touched down and disgorged a team of federal agents dressed in tactical gear and carrying the authority of the United States government. These were not local deputies who might be swayed by Karen's badge and bluster. These were federal officers responding to a reported threat against a protected wildlife facility. Agent Thompson, a tall man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to serious federal investigations, approached our group with professional authority. His credentials identified him as a senior wildlife enforcement agent with jurisdiction that superseded any local police power Karen might claim. "I am Agent Thompson, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service," he announced to the assembled group. "We received reports of interference with a federally protected wildlife rehabilitation facility. Who is in charge of this law enforcement response?" Karen stepped forward with what remained of her official bearing, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes as she faced real federal authority for the first time in her career. "I am Sheriff Martinez," she said, attempting to maintain her authoritative tone. "We were investigating potential illegal wildlife activities on this property." Agent Thompson's expression hardened as he reviewed the federal permits I provided and compared them with the database information on his tablet. "Sheriff Martinez, this facility is in full compliance with all federal wildlife protection statutes. What specific illegal activities were you investigating?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Karen had no legitimate answer because there had been no legitimate investigation. Her entire presence on my property was based on her personal desire to intimidate me into providing cabin rentals that did not exist. "We received complaints about unauthorized activities," Karen replied vaguely, clearly struggling to fabricate a legitimate reason for her presence. Agent Thompson turned to me with professional courtesy. "Ms. Mitchell, please describe the events that led to this federal response." I provided a complete account of Karen's arrival, her demands for cabin access, her threats to use police authority against my federally protected facility, and her attempts to intimidate me into violating federal wildlife protection regulations. Agent Thompson documented every detail, while Corinne's deputies looked increasingly uncomfortable with their sheriff's exposed position. "Sheriff Martinez," Agent Thompson said with the calm authority of federal law enforcement, "interfering with federally protected wildlife operations is a serious federal offense. Attempting to use local police authority to override federal wildlife protections constitutes abuse of power under federal statutes." Corinne's remaining guests had abandoned her completely, loading their vehicles and departing without a word. The weekend getaway that had started this confrontation was ending with their sheriff facing potential federal charges for corruption and abuse of authority. Agent Thompson's team began a formal investigation, photographing the scene, interviewing witnesses, and documenting every aspect of Corinne's attempted intimidation. Federal investigators treated this as seriously as any other threat to protected wildlife operations, regardless of whether the threat came from poachers or corrupt local officials. "Ma'am," one of the federal agents said to me, "we will need a complete statement detailing Sheriff Martinez's threats and attempts to interfere with your facility operations. This documentation will be essential for any federal charges that may result from this investigation." Corinne watched helplessly as federal agents methodically documented her misconduct. The same authority she had wielded so carelessly against law-abiding citizens was now being applied to her own actions, and she had no power to stop or influence the investigation. Deputy Rodriguez approached Agent Thompson with obvious concern. "Sir, our department had no knowledge of any jurisdictional issues when we responded to the sheriff's backup request. We were told this was a standard trespassing call." Agent Thompson's response was professional but pointed. "Deputy, federal law enforcement will be conducting a full investigation into this incident. Your cooperation in documenting exactly what occurred here will be appreciated." The federal investigation had begun, and Sheriff Corinne's career was about to face scrutiny that her local corruption could not survive. News of Sheriff Corinne's federal investigation spread through our small mountain community like wildfire through dry timber. Within hours of the federal agents departing my property, local radio stations were reporting that their sheriff was under investigation for interfering with a federally protected wildlife facility. By evening, the story had reached regional news outlets who recognized the significance of a corrupt local official facing federal charges. But the most shocking development was not the media attention. It was the flood of phone calls I began receiving from other community members who had suffered under Corinne's abuse of authority, but had been too intimidated to speak out before. The federal investigation had given them the courage to share their own stories of corruption and misconduct. Mrs. Henderson from the general store called to tell me about the time Corinne had threatened to shut down her business unless she provided free supplies for Corinne's personal camping trips. The threat had been veiled as community cooperation with law enforcement, but the message was clear: comply with Corinne's demands or face harassment disguised as official police business. Tom Rodriguez, no relation to the deputy, contacted me about Corinne's attempts to force him to sell his property to her brother-in-law at below market value. When Tom refused, Corinne began citing him for imaginary code violations and threatening to have his business license revoked. Only his decision to sell and move to another county had ended the harassment. The most disturbing call came from Sarah Chen, a young teacher who had been stopped by Corinne multiple times for suspicious driving after refusing to provide free tutoring for Corinne's daughter. The stops always occurred when Sarah was alone, late at night, and Corinne's behavior during these encounters had been deliberately intimidating and inappropriate. Each story followed the same pattern. Karen would identify something she wanted from a community member, make her demands seem like official police business, and then use threats of legal harassment to force compliance. Anyone who refused to cooperate became a target for ongoing intimidation disguised as law enforcement activity. The federal investigation team returned to our community 3 days after the initial incident to interview these additional witnesses. Agent Thompson established a temporary field office in the town hall, where a steady stream of Karen's victims came forward to provide sworn statements about years of corruption and abuse of power. Ms. Mitchell, Agent Thompson told me during one of our follow-up interviews, what started as an investigation into interference with your wildlife facility has uncovered a pattern of corruption that extends far beyond this single incident. Sheriff Martinez appears to have been using her position to extort and intimidate citizens for personal benefit. The internal affairs investigation launched by Karen's own department moved with surprising speed once federal oversight removed any possibility of local cover-up. Deputy Rodriguez, who had shown integrity during the confrontation at my facility, was appointed as interim sheriff, while Karen was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of federal charges. Karen's attempts to control the narrative failed spectacularly when local media obtained copies of my video documentation from the day of the confrontation. Watching Karen threaten a law-abiding citizen while dismissing federal law destroyed any remaining public support she might have claimed. The county commissioners called an emergency meeting to address the crisis of confidence in their law enforcement leadership. Citizens packed the meeting room to demand accountability and reform. The same people who had been too afraid to challenge Karen individually found strength in numbers as they shared their experiences with her abuse of authority. For too long, we allowed fear of retaliation to keep us silent about Sheriff Martinez's misconduct, said Mrs. Henderson during the public comment period. It took federal agents protecting a wildlife sanctuary to give us the courage to protect our own community. The federal courthouse in the county seat became the focal point of intense media attention as formal charges were filed against Karen. The indictment included federal charges for interference with protected wildlife operations, abuse of authority under color of law, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Each charge carried potential prison time and the certainty of ending her law enforcement career permanently. Karen's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, but the federal prosecutors were not interested in lenient treatment for a corrupt official who had terrorized her own community for years. The message they intended to send was clear. Abuse of police authority would face the full consequences of federal law regardless of the perpetrator's local connections or political influence. The wildlife sanctuary that had started this confrontation became a symbol of resistance to corruption and proof that federal protections could shield law-abiding citizens from local tyranny. My peaceful mountain facility had inadvertently exposed the rot at the heart of our local law enforcement and provided the catalyst for long-overdue reform. 6 months after Sheriff Karen first attempted to intimidate her way onto my property, I stood in the federal courthouse watching her receive the justice that her victims had waited years to see. The judge's words rang through the courtroom with the finality of absolute authority. Karen Martinez, you have been found guilty of federal civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and interference with protected federal operations. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Karen's face remained stoic as the gavel fell, but I could see the reality of her situation finally settling in. The badge that had given her power over others was gone forever. The authority she had abused so carelessly had been stripped away by the same federal system she had claimed to supersede. The community that had lived in fear of her retaliation for so long gathered outside the courthouse to witness her departure in federal custody. There was no celebration, only a collective sigh of relief that years of corruption had finally ended. Deputy Rodriguez, now the elected sheriff, addressed the crowd with a promise of transparency and accountability that Karen had never offered. Our department will earn back your trust through our actions, not our words, he said. The abuse of authority that occurred under the previous administration will never be tolerated again. My wildlife sanctuary had become more than just a rehabilitation facility for injured animals. It had become a symbol of how federal protections could shield law-abiding citizens from local corruption. Visitors now came not only to learn about wildlife conservation, but to hear the story of how federal law had prevailed over small-town tyranny. Agent Thompson visited the sanctuary regularly to check on its operations and ensure that no further interference occurred. During one of his visits, he brought news that the federal wildlife protection program was expanding, with additional funding for facilities like mine that served both conservation and educational purposes. Your courage in documenting and reporting Sheriff Martinez's misconduct has helped protect other wildlife rehabilitation facilities across the region, he told me. Federal authorities take threats to these operations very seriously, and your case has become a precedent for swift federal response to similar incidents. The animals in my care seem to sense the return of peace to their sanctuary. Ranger, the red-tailed hawk whose recovery had been interrupted by Karen's arrival, had been successfully released back to the wild. The orphaned deer had grown strong enough to survive on their own and were preparing for release before the first winter snows. New wildlife arrived regularly, brought by forest rangers and conservation officers who trusted my facility's reputation for professional care and successful rehabilitation. Each animal represented another opportunity to fulfill the mission that Karen had tried to destroy through her abuse of authority. The mountain mornings were peaceful again, filled only with the sounds of recovering wildlife and the satisfaction of meaningful work. My federal permits remained in their place of honor on the office wall, but they now carried additional significance as symbols of protection against future corruption. Community members who had found their voices during Karen's investigation continued to attend county meetings and hold their elected officials accountable. The culture of fear and intimidation that had allowed Karen's corruption to flourish was replaced by engaged citizenship and transparent governance. The sanctuary thrived under federal protection and community support. Each successful animal release reminded me that justice and persistence could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Sheriff Karen had learned that federal law was not a suggestion to be dismissed by local authority, and my mountain sanctuary remained a place where wildlife could heal in peace. The mountains had taught Karen their lesson, and that lesson would echo through federal case law for years to come.